Mr. Trela received his bachelor's and law degree from Northwestern University with high honors. Shortly after receiving his law degree, he began his career serving as a law clerk to Judge Robert Specker on the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and Justice John Paul Stevens on the United States Supreme Court. Connie joined Sidley Austin in 1981 and became a partner in 1986. He co-chairs the firm's Supreme Court and appellate practice groups in the Chicago office. Is one of the national leaders of the firm's Supreme Court and appellate national practices teams. He's argued more than 80 cases with the Supreme Court of the United States Courts of Appeals, and state supreme and intermediate appellate courts. I don't know if you guys know what that means, but as a lawyer, that's big time stuff. He's been cited in various publications and received numerous awards of recognition for his work, such as recognition in the Best Lawyers in America as a 2015 Chicago Lawyer of the Year in Appellate Practice, and was recognized as Best Lawyer in Appellate Practice in Commercial Litigation throughout various years. Connie also serves as an instructor in the Supreme Court Practicum at Northwestern University School of Law and speaks frequently on appellate practices, intellectual property law, and other topics. He's also an avid runner, having completed 11 Chicago marathons and having qualified for and completed the Boston Marathon. It's my privilege to introduce to the class of 2019 our fellow alum, Mr. Connie Trela, class of 1973.
Well, good morning. After that fancy introduction, I'm afraid that this may be a bit of a letdown for you, but let me give it a try. Let me start by thanking the school and all of you for having me here this morning. Although it's been a long way in years since I was in your position, Notre Dame has never been very far away from me in ways that I hope to convey to you this morning. But before I do that, I want to thank someone else. And actually, I want to thank them on your behalf. And that's your parents. Your parents made a real sacrifice to send you to school here. Although I know the school does its best to make it affordable to go here, it is not cheap. And sending you here probably means that many, maybe most of your parents had to give up some things that they otherwise would have wanted. You know, maybe a new car, a vacation, or something else. And they did that even though they could have sent you to a public high school for free. And I suspect that for most of you, the public high school you would have gone to was, you know, perfectly safe, it had good facilities, and it would give you a good education. But your folks wanted something more for you. And I hope that they and you feel that they got something more, that you got something more. And so I think if you have not already thanked them for sending you here, you should do it, and you should do it often. As the years go by, I think the real benefit of their sacrifice will become clear to you. Trust me, it will, and so take my word for it and thank them in advance. So it's been a long time since I was here. I was in the class of 1973, which is probably before some of your parents were even born. I have a lot of fond memories of my 4 years here, memories of teachers and football and basketball games and friends. And on the friends front, actually a week from this weekend, my wife and I are hosting sort of an informal reunion at our home for about 8 or 10 of our classmates. One of the attendees is Jim Biazzi in the back there, which I think tells you something about the bonds that form when you're here. It's actually sort of a meeting of what we call the Winter Sports Club. Back then, probably not as important as it is now, but you wanted to have activities that you could show on, college applications and that sort of thing. And, some of us had activities, some of us didn't, so we decided to form our own club. We call it the Winter Sports Club. It was not actually recognized by the school, but if you go back into the yearbook and look up, the senior class list, you'll see either Winter Sports Club or WSC next to a bunch of names, and that was our informal club. So even though I have memories, vivid memories, or at least think I do, from 1973, I decided to pull out my old yearbook to fill in some gaps and make sure that what I think I remember is at least roughly accurate. Now, 1973 was a pretty special year here. You won't be able to see this, but on the cover of the yearbook, that's Senator Ted Kennedy. Now, apparently, Senator Ted Kennedy spoke at Notre Dame during my senior year. I say apparently because I have absolutely no recollection of that happening, even though I'm sure it was a really big deal at the time. We probably had Secret Service here and everything, but I had no memory of that at all. But way more important than a U.S. Senator, the class of 1973, there were 275 of us, by the way, there were two guys who would go on to play major roles in the future of Notre Dame and in your lives. I'm talking, of course, about Coach Allegretti and Mr. Boylan, both members of the class of 1973. Now, Dick Allegretti, it probably won't surprise you to learn, was voted most likely to have a great head of hair 46 years after graduation. Now, I obviously was not, but I think if you had said to somebody in our class that Dick Allegretti would come back sometime to coach baseball here, we would have said, yeah, I can see that happening. Now, Jim Boylan, on the other hand, is a different story. He probably would have been voted most likely to never set foot on the property again, and particularly as a teacher. Now, I'm kidding about that, of course, but I will say that when my son, who graduated from here in 2006, came home and told me for the first time that his history teacher was a guy named Jim Boylan, I had to ask him about 4 times to repeat that before it really sank in. But I will say that I know that those of you who've had him for class know that he's a great history teacher. My son is a whiz at trivia, I think, because of the things that Mr. Boylan taught him. So if you would like to see pictures of these 2 illustrious alums when they were your age, you can stop up afterwards and I'll share my yearbook with you. Another one of our classmates, Mike Marisi, is here at Notre Dame. He does work with the Parents Association and other things that you may not see, but that make a big difference in the school here. So you can see that the class of 73 has a real connection to this school, even more than 40 years later. Now, besides the handsome photos of Dick and Mike and Jim, I've noticed some other things when I went through the yearbook. One thing I noticed is that in the senior class list at the back of the book, my name, actually both my first and last names, are misspelled, which is pretty remarkable, but not quite as remarkable as the fact that it took me 46 years to notice that my name was misspelled. Now, it may not be that surprising, because when you think back, and this may be hard for you guys to fathom, but this yearbook was put together with nothing electronic at all. It was typed on a real typewriter. It was cut and pasted together, and I mean literally cut and pasted, not virtually cut and pasted, which is a process you probably can't even imagine. The guys who did that are in a picture at the back of the book. Let's see if I can get it here. And you probably can't see, but one of them up in the corner here, it's Bill Simpkins, and he's wearing a black formal suit, which is only slightly creepy because Bill's dad was the local undertaker, and Bill went on to become an undertaker himself, so I don't even want to think about where that suit was or where it ended up afterwards. The yearbook brought back a lot of great memories, and it made me think not only about high school itself, but also about what Notre Dame has meant in the many years since then. Now, I always had sort of a general vague sense that Notre Dame did a pretty good job preparing me for life after high school. But I never really thought about it in any specific way until my son went to school here. One thing I think you'll learn when you become parents is that you give a lot more thought and pay a lot more attention to your kids' well-being and education than you ever did to your own. The fact that my son went to school here was sort of interesting. I never really pushed him in this direction. We lived in the Notre school district at the time, so he obviously had a great public high school he could have gone to. We lived only a few miles from Loyola Academy. He could have gone there, but he chose Notre Dame. I'm not sure why, but I think maybe he could tell from the way that his mom and I talked about the place. By the way, I met my wife, Jean, his mom, when I was a student here, and she was a student at Regina Dominican. But maybe he could tell from the way we talked about the place, or the fact that some of my best friends in the world date back to high school, or something else, that this was a special place, and I think he wanted some of that for himself. So finally, let me get to the point of this talk, which is, what is it that made, and I think still makes, Notre Dame special? What do I think it did for me, and what do I hope and think it will do for you? Now, I learned a lot here, as I'm sure you have. You've learned about dates and battles and elections and historical things from Mr. Boylan and your other history teachers. You've learned all about atoms and gravity and scientific things from Dr. Fish and Ms. Pellrine and your other science teachers. You're probably good or not at trigonometry and differential calculus and that sort of thing. And all of that will be important, certainly in the near term, and certainly for those of you going on to college, technical training, or the military. But I've got bad news. You're going to forget it, probably most of it, and probably not that long from now. You'll remember that you used to know it, but that's about all you'll remember. But here's the good news. You learned something else here too. It's something far more important than particular facts or formulas or physical laws. You learned a way of thinking, a way of approaching and solving problems, and not just academic problems, the kind of things you'll run into in a college classroom or other school somewhere, but problems that force you to figure out what kind of a person you are and what kind of a person you want to be. And I think and I hope that Notre Dame has prepared you to address those kinds of problems, because those are much tougher problems than anything you'll run into in a college classroom. Now, if I had to name one key lesson that Notre Dame taught me, and I think that it's probably taught you, it's to think about others and not just yourself in every situation. Forgetting to do that, I think, is the source of most problems, big and small, personal and societal. And when I think back on mistakes that I've made about the things I wish I could do over, it almost always was because I was thinking about myself and not other people. It's easy to do, it's almost impossible to avoid completely, but it's always a mistake. And to be clear, I'm not saying that means that you always do something for somebody else, that you never put your own interests first. I don't think anybody expects us to be St. Francis or Mother Teresa. But the important thing is to think about the implications of what you're doing for others. It may be that after you weigh all the facts, that the right answer is, well, yeah, I'm going to do what's best for me, but do it while you're thinking of others, not just yourself. Now, when I asked Mary Beth what I should specifically talk about, she said three things. One was keep it clean. She actually said that about 5 times, so I don't know if that's because of me or if because there have been incidents in the past. And she also said, she gave me a strict time limit, which, as Ralph and the other lawyers in the room know, should not be a problem. And she said I should talk about my journey as a Don, how I got from here to where I ultimately ended up. So let me try that. As Tom told you when he introduced me, I'm an attorney. I've had, I think, a pretty good career over the last 40 years since I graduated from law school. And you might think that was a result of careful thought and planning, a career path that I mapped out, maybe when I was here at Notre Dame, maybe even starting earlier. But you'd be wrong. Things worked out as they did Not because I planned anything or gave it a lot of thought, but I think because first I was really lucky, and second, Notre Dame prepared me to take advantage of opportunities and challenges when they hit me in the face. Now you're bombarded, I'm sure, with advice and warnings about how you've got to plan your future. You've got to find your passion, whatever that means, and figure out what college or other next step you're going to take to get you to that goal. And if you don't do it and do it right now, you're in real trouble. There was some of that when I was in high school, but it wasn't nearly the constant theme that it is today. I don't think we felt the same pressure that you might when we were 18 years old to figure out exactly what kind of a life and career we were going to have. One message I'd like to leave you with today is don't worry if you don't have a plan, and if you do have a plan, don't count on it lasting for very long. There's a saying that goes something like, if you want to see God laugh, tell him your plans, because it almost never works out the way you might think it will. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's important to think about the future and do some planning, but I think it's more important to be alert and open to opportunities. Plan and prepare yourself for that, not for some particular goal or some particular path. The last thing you want at this point in your life is to be so narrowly focused on one goal that you don't see other opportunities when they arise. Now, my own path after Notre Dame is probably a good example of that, although I will confess that it's more than a little embarrassing to lay out exactly how I got to where I ended up. And I offer this not as an example of what you should do. You most certainly should not do what I did. But I think it's an example of when you have the kind of preparation that you get here at Notre Dame, things can work out pretty well even when you do your best to mess them up. My dad was a contractor, and I worked with him weekends and summers from the time I was in grade school, and I sort of thought I would just follow in his footsteps. I liked the work, I was pretty good at it, and it wasn't at all clear to me that I would even go to college. My parents, though, wanted me to go, and so I started looking into that. Notre Dame had a college counseling office at the time, but the whole process was much less organized and elaborate than it is today. Among other things, there was no internet. So you couldn't just sit at a screen and pardon me, page through 200 colleges in a few minutes. You had to actually read stuff. There were college nights when schools would send people here to talk about their schools and ask questions. And I used some of those resources, but it was confusing and it seemed like a lot of work. So I came up with a brilliant alternative strategy. I was dating a girl, then not my future wife Jean, but a girl named Linda. And so I figured, well, I'll just do what Linda does. Linda was smart and she was doing a lot of research. So she applied to 3 schools, Rice University in Houston, which I'd never heard of, Michigan State, and Northwestern. So I applied to those 3 schools and only those 3 schools. We got into them, so now I had to decide where to go, or rather Linda had to decide where to go. So she decided to go to Northwestern. I was in love, or thought I was, so of course I decided to go to Northwestern too, with no real thought about what I would study or how I was going to pay for it, or any of the details like that. Well, of course, I needed to be at the same school as Linda. Well, of course, we got there, we were there about a month, and Linda looked around and realized there are a lot of guys here that are way better than this guy, so she dumped me. So here I am. I picked my college because of my girlfriend, and now I don't have the girlfriend, but I've got the college. And it gets better or worse, depending on your perspective. I mentioned that I picked Northwestern without any real thought about what I would study, but that's not quite true. I actually did give it some thought for about a minute, and figured I'd get a bachelor's degree in business. I mentioned that my dad had a small contracting business. There was a sort of an introductory business class here at Notre Dame at the time, and I kind of liked that, so it made sense. But I learned a valuable lesson. Thinking about something is not a substitute for doing some research and getting some actual facts. Because, to my surprise, I learned that Northwestern didn't have an undergraduate business program. It hadn't had one for decades. Go figure. So here I am, no girlfriend, no major, and probably the wrong college. But it turned out it wasn't the wrong college. In fact, it may have been the perfect college because it meshed almost perfectly with what I had learned at Notre Dame. I vividly remember when I started classes at Northwestern, I was worried about how I would measure up against the Notre kids and the fancy private prep school kids who went to Northwestern. But I realized pretty early on that Notre Dame had prepared me for college, at least that college, better than most of my classmates. It seemed like every class I took at Northwestern was just a logical continuation of the classes I had taken here at Notre Dame. It was like the next semester of the classes here. Even math class, which was challenging for me here at Notre Dame, it seemed easy at Northwestern. So I don't think the classes actually were that easy. I think Notre Dame just prepared me better than I thought I had been prepared. So I recovered from my broken heart, and I found a major, economics, that was sort of like business and that I ended up really liking. And then, more important, I started dating Jean, who I had met here at Notre Dame. So my life was back on track. But it didn't last long, because as the end of my college career was getting closer, I had to decide what I was going to do next. You basically couldn't do anything with an econ degree, an undergraduate econ degree back then. And as those of you my age and older will remember, 1973 was a terrible time in the job market, or 76 rather, when I graduated, was a terrible time in the job market. So my choices were basically join my dad as a contractor, get a graduate degree in econ, or do something else. My dad sort of discouraged the contractor idea. I like to think that it was because he saw some other talent in me, but it might have been because I wasn't as good at that kind of work as I thought I was, and he didn't want to have to deal with me. But for whatever reason, I had never really thought about law or law school, but I saw a poster at Northwestern about the LSAT test. And so with my usual careful attention to planning my future, I figured, why not? Prep classes for standardized tests were not really a thing that you did back then. So all I had to do was pay the test fee and show up. So I did that. I took the test and I did pretty well on it. But I still wasn't sold on law school. I didn't have any lawyers in the family. I didn't really know any. There were a few TV shows about lawyers like Perry Mason and Judd for the Defense, but they didn't make the law seem as exciting as the TV shows now do. Those shows, by the way, are not terribly accurate, other than the part where, as you can tell from Mr. Ellsworth and Tom and me, lawyers are in fact all movie star handsome, but other than, but other than that, they're pretty inaccurate. I also had a couple of econ professors at the time who were encouraging me to go to grad school, in econ, which I at least knew something about. But so rather than decide anything definite, I figured, well, I might as well go ahead and apply to law school. But I had a problem this time because my girlfriend now, Jean, had no interest in law school, so she wasn't going to be applying. So that meant I would have to actually think about this myself and make my own decision, for probably the first time in my life. For cost reasons, I decided to apply only in Chicago so I could live at home. And I applied to 3 schools, Northwestern, Loyola, and the University of Chicago. I was accepted, and so now I really had to decide whether I was going to go to law school, and if I was going to go, where I was going to go. As luck would have it, that decision ended up being pretty easy because I got a full tuition scholarship offer at Northwestern. And as luck would have it, law and I ended up being a pretty good match. Around the time that I started law school, the courts and law professors and lawyers were just beginning to start applying principles from economics to the law. And so my accidental choice of a major ended up being exactly the right choice at the right time. Whether because of that or otherwise, I ended up doing pretty well in my law school classes, and that made it possible for me to start my legal career with the clerkships that Tom mentioned. A clerkship is a 1 or 2 year job where you work directly with a judge. You help the judge write his or her decisions, and you get to learn how the court system works from the inside. You get to hear what the judges actually think about lawyers, what kind of arguments work and what arguments don't work, and it's sort of like a graduate degree in law. And if you're lucky, and I was, you form a relationship with the judge that lasts long after the job is over. As Tom mentioned, one of my clerkships was with Judge Sprecher in Chicago, and the other was with Justice Stevens in Washington. Judge Sprecher passed away a few years ago, but he and I had kept in touch over the years. He was at my wedding, he and I went to ball games afterwards and that sort of thing. And Gene and I are heading down to Florida in a couple of weeks together with Justice Stevens' other former law clerks to spend a weekend with him to celebrate the 99th birthday that he had about a week ago. So that's the kind of bond that you form in that position if you're with the right kind of judge. Now, both of those jobs were great learning experiences, and they opened up opportunities for me afterwards in the government, law schools, or private practice in a private law firm. I chose the law firm route. As Tom mentioned, I joined Sidley & Austin in 1981. It was a big firm at the time. We had almost 300 lawyers in 3 cities in the U.S. Today we have about 1,800 lawyers in 24 cities around the world. Since my idea of practicing law was 1 or 2 lawyers sharing an office and a secretary, the culture shock still hasn't completely worn off. Now, for several years, one of my jobs there was I was chair of the hiring committee, and among the folks hired on my watch were a young lawyer named Michelle Robinson, and a few years later, a first-year law student named Barack Obama. Now, Barack, we called him Barack back then because Mr. President would have seemed sort of awkward. He was hired for a summer clerkship position, and like all of our summer clerks, he was assigned a mentor or an advisor. Barack's advisor was Michelle, and they formed a close relationship. The relationship blossomed after Barack went back to Harvard Law School in the fall, and they got married, and the rest, as they say, is history. Let me just take a minute or two to describe what I do besides hiring future presidents and first ladies, and then I'd like to open it up for some questions from you. Law practice, broadly speaking, falls into 2 general categories: litigation and transactions. Litigation means you go to court and handle lawsuits. Transactions is basically everything else. Corporate mergers, helping people buy a home, writing wills for people. I'm in litigation, and in a particular kind of litigation. One thing you find in large law firms like mine is that everybody is a specialist. None of us does everything, and most of us, including me, are pretty worthless outside of our specialties. When you do appellate litigation like I do, what you do basically is when a client has lost a case at trial, you try to convince an appeals court that the trial court decision should have come out the other way, or at least that your client should get another shot. And it's pretty much the same on the civil or criminal side, just in general terms. You guys are probably more familiar with criminal law just from TV and from the newspapers, but it's the same thing in private business type lawsuits. You lose a case at trial, and then you go up on appeal and try to get it turned around. Lawyers like me who specialize in appeals, we don't question witnesses, and we don't argue in front of juries like the way you see on television. Most of our work is done in writing. We write what are called briefs, although they're anything but brief. Actually, I'm not even sure how they got that name. But we try to explain to the appeals court why the trial court got it wrong and why our client should have won. The only time we're in a courtroom is after all those papers are filed at what's called the oral argument. The oral argument is the lawyer's chance to argue in person in front of 3 judges if you're in a court of appeals, or 9 justices if you're in the Supreme Court. You get a certain amount of time, 15 minutes in a court of appeals usually, or 30 minutes aside in the Supreme Court, and you usually spend most of that time answering questions from the judges. A typical oral argument will be, I'll talk for about a minute and then get interrupted with questions, and they don't stop until your time's up. The time limits are strictly enforced, especially in the Supreme Court. When your time is up, there's usually a set of lights on the podium. A yellow light goes on when you've got a couple of minutes left, and a red light goes on when your time is up. And when the red light comes on, you stop immediately. Unless you're in the middle of answering a judge's question, then you finish your answer, and then you stop immediately. There's a story that I did not witness, but I've got from somebody who did, about a lawyer who was doing his first argument in the Supreme Court. He was probably nervous, and he, written out his presentation, and he basically had his head buried in the paper and was reading it to the court. He didn't notice his red light come on. He also didn't notice that the justices just got up and walked out when the time was up. They didn't stop him, they just let him keep talking, and they went out because it was lunchtime and they were not going to miss lunch to hear this guy ramble on. That's another indication of why it's important to maintain eye contact when you talk to people. You want to make sure they're still standing in front of you. So that's the, I've talked without any questions for far longer than I'm used to, so I'd like to get some questions, but before I do that, the other thing Mary Beth told me was to say something about networking. I'm not sure that I have any brilliant insights about that. Networking as such wasn't really a thing when we were in school. Among other things, there was no internet, so there was, you couldn't have the social media type networking, LinkedIn and that sort of thing that you have today. So the networking we did, although we didn't call it that, was just a matter of, meeting people, finding out about them, and letting them know about you. And the one thing I've learned from that is that you really never know how or when some connection that you've made will pop up. I've had cases come to me years later from somebody I met, including from people I met in a setting that had nothing to do with the law, but they remembered something and they had a need for a lawyer, and so they called me. So I don't think you can or should try to be overly strategic in your networking. It may be a generational thing, but there are a few things that I find more off-putting than when I meet somebody and immediately get the impression that they're trying to sell me something, or they're trying to size me up to figure out what I might be able to do for them. Treat the people you meet as people first, not as business opportunities, and the opportunities will eventually follow. So those are my words of wisdom on networking, and so now I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Anybody? And by the way, these questions will not be graded. There was a reference to grading earlier, so don't worry about that. Yeah.
Is there any particular cases that stuck out to you, or any that made you reflect on your time here at Notre Dame?
The question was whether there was any particular case that stood out for me or that made me reflect on my time here at Notre Dame. Actually, probably one case that really does stick out, and it was not an appellate case. It was not for one of my normal business clients, but lawyers do what's called pro bono work, and that's work you do for free for people who can't afford lawyers. Sometimes it's criminal stuff, which I didn't do because I don't know anything about criminal law, so I wouldn't be doing anybody a favor by representing them. But we had a case for a grandmother, inner city grandmother, who was wanted to adopt her daughter's children, her grandchildren. Her daughter was a drug addict, was nowhere to be found, and because of the way the law was, even though this woman was their grandmother, she couldn't enroll them in school, she couldn't get medical care for them. I think it may be easier now, but back then, if you weren't the parent and the parent was alive, you were stuck basically. So she came to have us help her legally adopt them. And what I remember about the case was, at the time our offices were in what's now the J.P. Morgan Chase building. It was First National Plaza at the time, downtown, and we had our conference rooms on the 56th floor. This woman and her kids had never been in an elevator before, and they certainly had never been on the 56th floor of any place. One wall of that floor was all windows, and there was a hallway on the outside and conference rooms were on the inside. And I remember the kids running to the window and looking out, and the grandmother was plastered against the other wall because she was so terrified of being at that height. So that's what I remember about that case. But it was a, and I can't say that at the time I was thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to do this for free because that's what Notre Dame taught me. Because your brain doesn't work that way. But it's actually one of the cases I feel best about. Even though it, like I said, it wasn't a paying client, it was not a big win, it didn't get written up in the newspapers. But it really made a real difference for that woman and those kids. So, yeah, over there.
You a Cubs or a White Sox?
I've always been a White Sox fan. And I can't really explain why, because we grew up in Bucktown, which ought to be, Bucktown wasn't fancy back then. It was an old Polish neighborhood back then, which was Cubs territory. But my dad had been a Sox fan for some reason, probably because in the late 50s and early 60s the Sox were better than the Cubs, and so I've just always been a Sox fan. Yeah.
Are there any cases you're in right now?
Oh yeah. I've got a couple of, I've got one case, actually I got a bunch of cases. One area that I do a fair amount of work in is pharmaceutical patent products. I've got a case now involving a drug for prostate cancer. Got another one involving drugs for what are called autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis. And I have to confess that these are always challenging for me because one thing that Notre Dame taught me was that medical school was not in my future, because I always struggled in the science classes here. So I have to have people explain the science behind these things to me. But yeah, those are going on now, and I've got a case for a company called Tata Consulting, which is a huge Indian company that got whacked for $900 million in a trial up in Wisconsin. So they've hired us for the appeal in that. Yeah.
Have you always been comfortable speaking in front of people?
No, that's a good question, actually. I actually hate speaking in front of people. So my career choice was sort of an odd one. What I really liked about the appellate practice was, I mentioned that most of the work is in writing, and I really like that. I like thinking about problems and writing out arguments and that sort of thing. The speaking part of it always petrified me, but it's one of the things that I sort of forced myself to do. And because you can't really practice, you can't tell somebody, okay, well, I'll do all these papers, but then you're going to have to find somebody else to go to court for you. And I just over the years just sort of forced myself to do it largely through probably excessive preparation. I just, when I've got a case being argued, like I said, it's 15 minutes aside. I probably spend at least 50 hours preparing for that 15 minutes. So, yeah.
What's your favorite memory of Notre Dame?
Oh, that's hard to say, in part because I'm so old that it's hard to remember. It's seeing Jim Biazzi directly behind me there. We just had, and I'm sure, and I hope this is true for you guys, we formed some friendships that have lasted 40 years, and we had some really incredibly good times together. A bunch of us, I'm not the only one who met my wife while we were in high school, or soon thereafter. So it's just, I think it's probably not a specific memory, but just being together with a bunch of guys that you felt really close to. Anybody else? Yeah.
It seems like you're working in a very high environment. Your experience, having worked in those environments, you experience failure, and how do you deal with that?
Well, certainly, anybody who tells you that they've been in the law job or any other sort of job and never experienced failure is lying to you. So yeah, absolutely. And it's hard, and it can be really hard for somebody. You go through school, and particularly if you do pretty well, your failure is not something you really think about. But there have been plenty of times when I've lost in cases that I thought I should win, and there are times when I've lost and thought, if I had done this a little bit differently, it might have come out differently. And it's, I think it's just a matter of, okay, you learn from that. I'm not going to make that mistake again, and you try to move on. So, how are we on time? We're done? Okay, I'm done. Thanks, guys.
Connie, thank you very